Hey, welcome back to Tech Tip Tuesday. Today we're going to be talking all about strip piecing and some best practices for when you're including strip piecing in your pattern. So first of all, strip piecing is the process by which you'd basically take, usually with a fabric strip, so sometimes you cut those down into smaller chunks depending on the pattern first. You're going to sew them together along the length of those strips. You end up with this really long width of fabric length piece of fabric that we call a strip set. And then you're going to take that and take your ruler and cut that into segments. It's a really fast way to piece a lot of repetitive segments, really helpful for any kind of 4-patch, 9-patch kind of blocks, things along those lines, as well as if you've got like a courthouse step block or something like that that's got little cornerstones in it and kind of chain blocks. Really, really helpful for that. It does speed things up quite a bit, and it also makes you a little bit more accurate because you're not having to worry about this piece distorting on kind of all 4 sides. You only have to worry about it distorting on 2 sides because you are taking all your measurements after you've already sewn everything. Now, as far as with the fabric strips versus cutting things down, personally, the value to strip piecing for me when you're doing a lot of these units from Yardage is that you don't have to do any subcutting beforehand. You just cut your strips, sew them all together, and then you cut your pieces from that. So if I'm going to be doing a lot of strip piecing with Yardage, right, you're making multiple strip sets that are exactly the same, I'm not going to cut those down, even if that means I end up with half a strip set at the end. That's basically waste. I'm okay with that. But this is something that's very, very specific to the kind of audience you're catering to. Some people have very strong feelings over this, right? They don't want to end up with any excess because they want that piece of fabric in just kind of its singular strip form that's more useful to them in the future in terms of the scrappy designs that they're making. So this is something you probably want to poll your audience a little bit before to see what they like. But the only time I will kind of subcut a lot of my yardage with the fabric strips down into smaller chunks is if I'm doing something where I'm trying to do like one block in each color and I need different segments of the same strip because I only need a small number of pieces that are strip pieced from each strip set. Or if you've got like a fat quarter pattern, right, where you have strips coming from fat quarters that are basically half of a width of fabric, right, 21 inches or so, that's where I might have instructions to take all of your background yardage strips and just kind of cut them, lob them in half, right, just fold them in half and cut them down the middle, not measuring anything, and we're going to pair those with all of our strips that are going to come from fat quarters. Otherwise, this just gets out of hand very fast, right? You'll end up with a cutting table where you're cutting like 3 different variations of strip lengths in order to make all of your strip units with each size, and it gets out of control. It's very confusing to follow, and at the end of the day, it's saving you from wasting what, a third to a half of a with a fabric strip in a strip set. I'm okay with that. Totally good. Okay, so let's talk some kind of basic rules when you're including strip piecing in your pattern. The first is to always leave at least a ½ inch of extra on your strip set. A lot of people will try to make these very exact, right? If you need 4 2.5 inch segments, they're going to tell you to make a strip unit that's basically 10 inches long. 4 times 2.5, yep, that's 10 inches. But that assumes that you don't have to square up the edges, nothing gets wonky when you're cutting, and you can just knock off 4 strip segments without losing any fabric whatsoever. That's tricky for most of us to do, especially because it's pretty common that your strip units will get a little wonky as you're sewing them, right? And so you want to square off that end before you start. So I always recommend leaving at least a ½ inch. This goes for with the fabric strips as well. You want to make sure that you've got a little buffer on the end there. Now, if you've got selvages still attached, which is how most people sell these, that's perfectly fine. You can usually bump in a little bit into the selvages if it's going to be in the seam allowance. So kind of using exact numbers there is okay. But you never want to do it if you're cutting down segments for like a fat quarter or quilt or something like that. If you need 18 inches to go into your segments, you need to have 18.5 inches of your strip set so that you can square things off and correct for any wonkiness that happens as you're trimming these units down. The next thing is to include in your pattern a recommendation to kind of align to a horizontal central seam rather than just the edge of your fabric. And the reason for this is because a lot of times as we're sewing these strip units together, especially if you're doing more than 3 strips or so, a lot of times it's very easy for the edges of that strip set to start to get a little wonky, a little wavy on you, versus that seam tends to be very straight, right? When you're cutting strips, sometimes you get a little bit of a fold in the fabric and you'll get like a little jagged edge. You can still use that. I do it all the time. I'm far too lazy to go back and cut another strip of that or to just unfold my yardage. I don't have the space for that in my house. So it's very common for the edges, the raw edges of my strip sets to look look a little chewed up and not be perfectly straight, and that's okay. When I'm cutting strip units, what I'm going to do is align a horizontal line on my ruler to one of the center seams rather than to the raw edges of my fabric. That gives me much more accuracy and keeps that strip unit much more precise, which is what we want. So a lot of times in patterns, I will see, you know, cut strip units by aligning a horizontal line in your ruler to the edge of your strip set and a vertical line to, you know, whatever dimension you're working with, and making cuts against your ruler. Don't say that. You can very specifically instruct them to align a horizontal line on their ruler to a center seam. And it doesn't matter which seam if you've got more than one. You just want to kind of be close to the center as possible. That's going to give you the best accuracy. The next thing to think about is that darn scant 1/4 inch. Now I'm going to drop a link to a video all about why this is important and what it means for you as a designer. But this is really important when it comes to strip piecing, because a lot of times we're dealing with strips that are 1 inch wide, 3/4 inch wide, something like that. They can be very narrow, and you're going to sew a bunch of them together, right? So if your seam allowance is really off and you're sewing like 3 to 5 strips together to make your strip units, you're going to end up losing quite a bit of that height of your strip set just because your seam allowance is not accurate. And what that means is that if the ultimate goal is to sew this into like an 8.5 inch block, it's not going to be 8.5 inches anymore. It might be closer to 8 3/8 or something like that, right? You can lose quite a bit of excess, especially when you're stacking a bunch of seams together, and there's no room to trim up these things because generally you're sewing these strip units at the correct height. You're not going to trim them down later. You're not including extra overage to trim down. So if you are doing this, right, you're going to be doing a lot of strip piecing where this can become a problem in the pattern. You need to specify that you need to be using a scant 1/4 inch at the beginning of the pattern, or you need to include some extra overage so that you can include these trimming operations later and kind of correct for that if people are not very good at sewing scant 1/4 inches, like in a beginner pattern or something like that. So scant 1/4 inch is not something you can avoid. I cover all of this and more in the video that I linked to earlier. Make sure you go check that out if you're not familiar with the scant 1/4 inch, but this is not something you can just ignore because you don't want to deal with it as a designer. It's actually pretty important for kind of the mechanics of how a quilt pattern comes together. And even if you don't want to kind of force all of your patterns to use a scant 1/4 inch because you know your audience doesn't like it, you as the designer need to think about it and kind of work in some extra steps into your quilt to correct for it if you're not going to specify a scant 1/4 inch in your pattern. And the last kind of tip or best practice I have surrounding strip piecing is to sew the strips together in opposite directions to keep the warping balance. So I will see this frequently in quilt patterns that use strip piecing. They'll add a note or something like that to just remind people that this is a good practice for best results. So if I sew my first pink strip coming from kind of this end of the strip set, I'm going to sew the other one coming from the opposite end, and that helps me just kind of keep the fabric from warping too much. We like to think of quilting cotton as non-stretchable fabric, but that's really not true. It does have some give to it, and that comes out in different ways, such as when you're sewing a 42-inch long seam. So if you can sew in opposite directions, especially if you're doing more than 3 strips together, that kind of helps keep this warping and slippage to a minimum, to where you don't have the fabric kind of trying to twist on you, especially as you're like trying to cut all of this down into strip units later. Not really ideal, so that's a nice note that you can add to your pattern to just kind of remind your reader that this is a really helpful tip when you are strip piecing. Alrighty, those are kind of the 4 best practices that I have when you're dealing with strip piecing. If you found this video helpful, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you next time for Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya!